Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Big Bros podcast. My name is Ilan, and I'm joined by my lovely friend and co-host, Jeremy. How are we?
I'm great, mate. I'm excited to be into the 70s now. This is officially episode 70, and that's a lot of episodes. I mean, we're slowly building up to that magical ton, aren't we?
Yeah, I know. It's I reckon we're gonna do something crazy for our 100th episode. I know we did a Q&A for our 50th, but 100th, it's like, bit of Ricky Ponting during the Ashes. We got to have a little bit of a celebration episode, I reckon.
Well, we've got 30 weeks to plan for it, so...
Yeah, true. That's still like...
we're getting a bit excited.
It's like half a year, I guess. But yeah. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about why closure and receiving closure, more specifically after you've been broken up with, is BS. And, I can go for a whole tirade, and I probably will. I'll probably go on a nice little rant at some point.
You already sound quite fervent about this episode.
Fervent. I like that. But,
Passion, energy.
because we both know I'm going to go on a rant, right? But before you let the shackles off me, what are your thoughts on closure?
Oh, I was excited for the shackles to be let off.
It's going to come off.
It sounded like they were ready to come off already. But yeah, it's a tough one because I think a lot of people typically have closure. A lot of people in relationships typically have closure, whether that means having some sort of a chat. I think it's rare where you just hear about the situation of just complete ghosting. And some might answer and say that, well, that's your closure. Like just being ghosted, being blocked, being deleted instantaneously. That's your closure. That's your answer. But I think that's a rare in a situation where, if you've been with someone for a long period of time, even if it's for a good half a year or so, and you've tried to really build up a special connection with them, and things just didn't work out naturally. I think having some level of conversation towards the end is more common than nothing at all. So based on that answer, I'd say some level of closure, I believe, is necessary. Doesn't need to be something really grand and involve like meeting up and talking about things after the breakup and, talking about different steps to be put in place together and, checking in on each other, maybe not to that extent. But I think some level of conversation and some levels of boundaries are necessary and need to be kind of spoken about.
So the latter of what you said is something I agree with to an extent. Now, my gripe with closure, and when people go through any form of breakup, they'll communicate that they need closure, that they need to meet up for one last coffee, one last walk in the park, one last meeting on neutral territory in order for them to grant them access to start moving on from their ex-partner. And I think this is such a limitation that people put on themselves.
It's like, sorry to interject, it's like the Cats and the Gold Coast Suns playing in the Northern Territory.
Oh, yeah? All right. Well,
on neutral grounds.
On neutral ground,
Not
exactly.
at Cardinia Park or at Heritage Bank Stadium.
Well, I would argue that for Gold Coast, that is more of an advantage because of the climate that they train up with.
True, so maybe Freo and Melbourne in the NT. Well,
then again, it's warmer in Perth. I mean, we can have a whole debate on the climate and, which teams are more advantaged at certain grounds. I remember Waverley Park. It's probably before our time. But anyways,
back to the point.
Back to the point, though. I think that a lot of people, especially when they're going through a breakup, will put this self-limiting belief that they can only start getting over the person. They can only commence their breakup healing after they've had a chat. And the problem there is you attribute so much control to the other person to acquiesce and say, yeah, let's meet up. Let's talk about all the reasons I broke up with you, even though I already stipulated it to you before we broke up. And I think here's the key thing. I think if you've been in a long-term relationship and it's been, a few years and it's coming to the end and you're breaking up, you're having that final conversation, I think everything has to be concluded in that conversation.
The breakup conversation.
Correct. Assuming no one has stormed off and, is in a lot of distress, which I guess is very normal and very common, you should try and get everything off the chest there and have it in the back of your mind, as difficult as it might be, that this will be your final conversation. Because I think a lot of people will also use the closure conversation as a way of, hoping that they can win back the other person. And that's another reason I have a little bit of a gripe with it, is because, the person will say, well, I need closure in this relationship before I can move on. When really they mean is, I need to try and convince you one more time to stay in this relationship. And I think that's also insanely unfair to the other person who's made the executive decision to break up with them. And usually you can smell the BS as well. It's like, I thought I made it clear to you I wanted to break up with you, and obviously you wouldn't be that harsh unless necessary. But I think you end up just, I guess, falling into a trap at times as well, where you get yourself into a meeting, especially if you're the one who broke up with the person, where you have to almost not only explain why you broke up with them, but also explain why you're not going to get back together with them. Does that make sense?
It does. It's also an opportunity, linking in with what you said about an opportunity presenting for one party to try win the other person over. It's also an opportunity for them to maybe wrongly in their head convince themselves that, you know what, fuck this person, and take an adverse approach entirely and try change the situation into something that it wasn't. And I think that's very unfair as well. And that's, in other words, known as emotional manipulation.
Sorry to interrupt you. So just to because I want to interpret what you're saying correctly, is you're saying that the person who wants the conversation about closure, they're using it to their advantage to see if they can almost set up this person for failure so that they have something against them, so that they can tell all their friends that they are a piece of shit person, and almost if there's a public reputation at stake after this breakup, that they're going to be viewed more favorably than the person who broke up with them.
Spot on. And I think it's all too common as well. I think, generally, if you're breaking up with someone, you're breaking up for good reasons, or for reasons that are at least logically and rationally thought out. It's rare when you go into a breakup and you've instantaneously, spontaneously just decided to do it there and then on the spot. It's generally something that's thought out over a period of time. That period might only be a matter of days, could be a week or so. Whatever it might be, it's still thought out. You have decided in your right mind that, you're going to break up with this person for the betterment of maybe both of you, but certainly for the betterment of you. You feel like you need to do this to put yourself first. And that's a very respectable thing to do, because you're acting with a lot of self-worth essentially, right? And that might essentially just hit the other person's ego. They don't like hearing that. You're rejecting them essentially, and that's hurting their ego. So, yes, that opportunity to have closure, if they ask you for closure, might be an opportunity for them to try win you back over, to try, band-aid that ego hit and make it feel lovey-dovey again, and give them that validation that they are after and that attention that they're after. But it can also be that adverse response where, because you've hit their ego, because you've damaged and wounded them and hurt them, they don't want to recognize that. They struggle to recognize that. And therefore, they want to hurt you even harder, even when it might not be necessary. And that is where emotional manipulation comes in. That's where they might come to you and say, you know what? You did this and you did that, and F you for doing that. And, it might even get a little bit more threatening, to the point where they might start threatening, taking some sort of actions, or telling people some sort of thing that happened that actually didn't happen. And that's where things get really messy, and that's where things get really toxic. And, so that's why I think, often we think about closure as this nice, comforting scenario, this nice, comforting walk in the park, like you said, this discussion to try win the person over. But it can also be the complete opposite, where it's that opportunity to try hurt that person harder than they hurt you.
And that's why I blocked all my exes.
Wow. Well, there we go.
God, I sound like a tool. But
well,
it's
you can
true.
laugh about it now, can't you?
I can laugh about it now, but at the time, I'll explain to you why. And I guess every breakup context
no, mate,
is
it's not sounding like a tool. It's, it's out of sight, out of mind is a necessary thing.
And I don't really care if people think I'm a tool, because I knew, and again, every relationship is different. I think I mean, my first relationship had a dysfunctional ending. I think we've spoken about it on the episode before, but you know, my closure was right then and there. I didn't need to call that person and say, "Why did you do this?" As soon as they told me that they committed some form of infidelity, that's the closure right there. You
Yeah.
can move on because
Yeah.
in my, you know, in my heart of hearts, that relationship isn't salvageable. It's not worth being salvageable. So you move on, and it's tough because you're essentially now forced. And here's the thing about closure as well: is those walks in the parks. It's a bit of that gradual removal of the band-aid. It's like, how can we gently take off that band-aid without it being so painful, right? And for me, my personal philosophy with any of, you know, things like
Life
breakups
doesn't
and
work that way, does it?
life doesn't necessarily work that way, but for the sake of my own healing, because you got to put yourself first, I just want to rip the band-aid off clean. So for me, that meant blocking them. And I think that's also a really important thing, that especially with breakups, is the fact that you don't do yourself any service when you take off the band-aid slowly, and
Hurts more.
it hurts more. And I think that's another gripe I've got with closure, is that you're going to be taking up that band-aid really slowly. And I just don't, and here's the thing, and I did mention it briefly earlier, but I just don't like this whole idea that you should attribute your level of happiness to someone else's decision to meet up with you or not. I mean, your self-esteem needs to be a bit higher than that, needs to be a bit stronger than that. You need to have a bit more self-respect. You should want to, at least, right? Because, I mean, and I like to use this as a good example of, like, sometimes when, to do with, like, to illuminate the standards you place on yourself versus the standards you place on others. So sometimes, like, I'll ask myself, like, what would I say to my future daughter or to my future son? And something I value quite a lot, and a value I'd really want to pass on to my future children, is the value of self-respect. You know, they're responsible for themselves. They're responsible for their own sense of happiness. Obviously, I'm going to be the best father I can be and help nurture those things out of them. But largely speaking, I want my kids to be resilient. I want them to understand that they can be happy on their own, that they don't need to be happy by relying on someone else. And I think if I start applying that rule to myself, which I'm trying to every day, and I mean, it's a battle, right? Like, everyone's going to be a hypocrite with their own values. I think things become a little bit more clearer, but it also does expose you to how difficult those things can be to live by those values, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, because as humans, all we ever want is to feel liked and loved by others. I mean, it's all good and well to give ourselves that love and likeness that we crave from others, and, you know, just be that person to give ourselves that self-love, you know, love yourself before you end up loving someone else. But we all want to be loved by someone else, right? And we all want to be liked, and we don't want to be, you know, disliked by other people. And I think life is learning that that's not how it works, and that, you know, you will be disliked by certain people, and not everyone is going to like you, and that's okay. And I think that's a nice point you raise about, you know, trying to get your future kids in the mindset of, you know, not relying on the validation more so from others, not necessarily, you know, the love from others, but you were speaking more about the validation. And I think that ties in really well with that closure, because that's often what a lot of this closure is thought of being. You know, people want to still feel validated. They want the person to feel like they're not angry towards them. They don't feel negativity towards them. They want to walk away knowing that, you know, yeah, we ended, but it was a happy ending. I mean, it was a nice closure is always glorified when you hear about relationship endings. I mean, that's often one of the questions that's asked when you hear about a relationship ending, is like, well, did you talk? Did you have closure? Did you talk it out? And then they often say, yeah, you know, we spoke it out and it was very amicable ending. It was a nice closure. And then the common response after that is, that's good. That's nice, you know? So it's a very glorified thing. And, you know, I think the glorified scenarios are, there might be lucky scenarios, because that's not the scenario that everyone finds themselves in. And that's okay, because when you think about it, like you said before, the breakup conversation should be the final conversation in a way. That should be the conversation where two humans come together. One might not like what's being said, but that's life at the end of the day. And a mature human should recognize that, you know, you're not going to like hearing certain things at a certain time point sometimes. And that's where you're truly tested as a human, is how you respond and react in the times where you don't often like hearing what's being told to you then and there.
Yeah, completely agree with you there. And I think as another thing, and I want to see if you agree with me. I've had tons of friends who have had those kind of closure walks with an ex of theirs. And then them and their ex, even if they had like an amicable ending, end up hating each other throughout the years. It's like you see how that person becomes different to you, and how, values wise, they're a different person to what they were. You're going to end up disliking that person naturally. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just within my friendship group, but you just find that even if you had that amicable ending, you still have this dislike towards the other person at some point, at least later down the line. Now, I don't know why that is, but I think it's just, I don't know, for me, it just reinforces the fact that a closure conversation, and I'm not talking about the closure conversation that you have in like the day you actually break up with them. I'm talking about like a closure conversation that happens 2-3 weeks down the line. I just think it's borderline useless in a lot of cases. I mean, there's always exceptions to the rule. I mean, let's say you're a married couple, you've got kids. This is not applying to them. I'm talking about, teenagers, late teenagers, people in their early 20s, maybe mid 20s as well. I guess people our age who are in those relationships. And I think this brings in something else to consider, which is once you do break up with that person, it's writing down everything you're feeling at that moment in time and asking yourself, what can I do to move on without needing to have another conversation with this person? And it's asking yourself questions of, what did they answer that I wasn't unsure of in this conversation tonight, being the breakup conversation you had in the evening, let's say, versus what didn't they answer. And sometimes you'll be left in more confusion trying to answer those questions, which is going to be even more distressing because, and the thing with the closure conversation as well is that, like, you might ask your partner, like, why did you actually break up with me? Is it because,
Fair question.
And they might not even always know the right reason. And maybe they have a really uncomfortable reason, and they were not going to want you to know. They want to spare you the feelings, not because they're particularly a good person, but they just don't want to be the bearer of bad news. They might not want to tell you, I just lost attraction for you. They might not say to you that, hey, I actually, have a crush on someone else, but I never told you this. It could be even smaller, less sinister reasons, like I don't like your family. It could be a myriad of reasons, and you might not even get the truth. And that's okay. And I think that's something that you should come to terms with, is that whatever answer they give you might not necessarily be an accurate one. And, in the back of your head, you might be thinking, well, I've been with this person for 2-3 years,
You feel like they owe to tell you whatever it is that's on your mind. Yeah, their minds, rather.
Exactly. And the thing is, it's like, sure, they're betraying me by breaking up with me, right? That's the feeling. Maybe it's a justified breakup. It could be. It doesn't... Just because you break up doesn't mean it's not justified. But in any case, you might delude yourself into thinking that they're going to be completely honest with you. And I'm a bit of a cynic with these things. So I think humans, we think the best of others more times than we should. I think we're just very self-interested creatures. I think that's just how we evolved.
Yeah, we're the main character. We think everyone owes us everything.
Exactly. And I don't think that that's actually how it's based in reality. I think a lot of times those closure conversations are filled with a lot of, as you would say, is, superficial information that isn't really at the core. Like, yeah, I just want to go find myself. Like,
just masquerading what is actually a different reason.
Yeah, and look, they could be completely honest with you. I'm not saying that there's not cases where they're not honest with you, but the potential for them actually not being truthful with you is very high. And then you know what the consequence of that is? You end up becoming so super fixated on a reason that might not actually be based in reality. Maybe, they said all these things about how they don't like the fact that you're not aligned with values, but it has nothing to do with it. Maybe they just lost attraction for you altogether. And you might then spend the next 2-3 weeks talking about and convincing yourself why you should get back with them because your values are more aligned, even though that's the fake reason they gave you to break up with you. So I think these closure conversations, they, as I said earlier, they're a self-limiting crutch.
It goes back to sometimes less is more, right? Sometimes just saying, I just don't want to be with you anymore, And that should sometimes just be enough, right? It doesn't need to be an essay. It doesn't need to be many WhatsApp paragraphs. It doesn't need to be 7.5 minute voice messages. I think we need to start, recognizing that, we're not owed anything. People shouldn't owe us stuff, regardless whether it's however long you've been together. I think, I guess just having an idea of what is going on, because I don't think ghosting is nice. I don't think you should ever ghost. I think everyone deserves to at least get a response of what is happening in that scenario. So ghosting, blocking instantaneous reactions, knee-jerk reactions, I don't think we support. But I think we're content with supporting the idea of sometimes less is more, and sometimes just saying things how they are is enough, not needing to sugarcoat stuff to make that person feel better, because they're going to feel shit regardless, and they can sense it coming on as well. So there's no way to sugarcoat a breakup. You're ending with that person, you're going to enter a time of no contact and not talking to one another and not seeing each other anymore and not being intimate. So it's going to feel shit regardless. So, I feel like sugarcoating it could actually make it worse, right? Because you're thinking, but it ended so nice. And then you're just forever holding on to that false sense of hope.
Yeah. And I mean, it also raises the question of sometimes people would break up with someone and then they'll suggest, well, this is just a temporary thing. Maybe if we find ourselves at different points in our lives.
Yeah, that's another one you hear of. It's like, well, maybe in X amount of years down the line, the stars might align and we might find ourselves together. I think that's again just a Disneyfication of breakups.
Yeah, major Disneyfication. And it's so much easier said than done. You'll attach yourself to that idea, right? Because you'll think, it's all good because, I'll end up with them and we'll live happily ever after. Typical, as you said, Disneyfication effect. But I think the best thing you can do there is just assume it's done. It's done. And
that there are other people out there that are good for you, because yes, we often get caught up in thinking of this person might be the one for us. But, this is something we've spoken about previously, that there are many people that are good for you. And the moment you start to open yourself up to the prospect of other people and just try better yourself as a person and let your walls down in good time, because, initially it's hard to let the walls down, but in good time, manifest those good things around you and they will come to you and you will open yourself up to good people. But with that being said, with the whole closure conversation, I still think it's relatively important to maybe have some level of boundaries, or to outline some form of boundary when you're having that breakup conversation. What do you reckon?
I mean, do you have kids with this person that would require you to have consistent communication?
I'm talking just about, our age,
Our age?
mid-20s, late 20s, early 20s, younger.
Okay, so let's look, fair question. So
I think boundaries are important, when you enter a relationship and when you finish a relationship.
Yeah, well, boundaries in that, okay, we're done now. So, if we're broken up, what does that mean? That means that we probably shouldn't chat to each other.
Yeah, well, that's a boundary, exactly.
And maybe I'm just being, maybe I'm just assuming that everyone possesses this kind of knowledge, but I mean, it should just mean that you shouldn't talk to that person. And I guess, look, I blocked my exes more for personal reasons than anything else, but out of sight, out of mind really helps. But truthfully, I think understanding that talking and communication is probably a disservice for the both of you. That's a good boundary to set in stone. But I think all these conversations have to be had on the night or the day of the breakup, right?
Yeah.
I'm not including the whole closure conversation, but more.
Well, that is the closure, right? On the night, on the day.
And that's the whole point of what I'm trying to say, is make sure that the breakup conversation that you have answers as many questions as you can, realistically, so that you don't feel like you need to convince yourself and convince the other person that you need to meet up one more time for a conversation on why you both need closure, because you can get the closure in that very evening or that very day. And I think in terms of actual boundary setting, everyone's going to be different. So I'm not going to, this could be a whole different episode on like what are, some do's and don'ts after a breakup. But I think, truthfully speaking, it's like, yeah, definitely go through some boundaries and say like, look, it's probably wiser we don't chat to each other for the foreseeable future. It's not a personal thing. It's just like, we're now leaving a dynamic that was insanely familiar to us.
You're grieving.
And again, pull that Band-Aid off as quickly as you can for yourself. And, you don't want to put yourself through this titrated dose of torture, right? Where you're still talking to them once or twice a week, checking in with how they're going. I mean, I may be a little bit torn on this because let's say you've been in a really long-term relationship and you genuinely just care for that person. And it was an amicable breakup, because a lot of breakups are amicable, and you just want to see how they're going. So you message them a week later being like, how are you feeling with everything? I'm like against that almost, because it's like the one person that they want to speak to about their grief is going to be you, and they can't do that. So by you messaging them asking how they're going in that moment in time, it's a titrated dose of torture. That's why I endorse out of sight, out of mind, no contact.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, it's hard to try be so rational and try be so logical when emotions are flying and firing. When you are having that breakup conversation, but that's just what it is. It sucks. It's hard, but that's life sometimes, and it's not always going to be rainbows and butterflies. And I think, if you're entering that breakup conversation, make sure that you're entering it with good rationale, good logic, and you've really developed your ideas before entering that stage, because, you should expect it to be a hard conversation, because it is, and expect the other person to really hate everything you're saying. But like you said, you really need to make sure that you rip off that Band-Aid as quickly as you can to save the pain down the line. And I think that pain down the line from that slow ripping of the Band-Aid is continuing the conversation, is checking in that week later, those 2 weeks later, saying, how are you going? Are you okay? Is having that closure conversation with the walk in a park. Like, all of that is... that the Band-Aid is still not off. You still got it on, and you're just slowly ripping it off. It's still pulling that person towards you. And yeah, it sucks, but you just need to rip it off quite quickly.
I think that's a nice closing message. I guess if we were to summarize everything here is, that closure, it's a self-limiting thing that people can place on themselves before they start their own breakup journey. That closure conversations aren't always going to be honest, especially when it comes to topics of why one partner decided to break up with the other partner. So I think it's up to anyone who's listening to this and might be in a breakup situation, is just to know that it's going to be okay if you rip off that Band-Aid earlier rather than later. It will be okay if you don't have that fantastical walk in the park, because you can decide your closure when you break up with that person. And it's up to you when you want to kind of move on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's probably the healthiest way to do it, because, like we've said, delaying it and keeping it on is just going to make it worse long term. So
awesome.
Rip it off, and you'll both be better for it. It's probably the most respectable thing for yourself personally and for them as well.
Awesome. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think that's the closure to the episode.
I love that. Perfect. On that note, guys, have a happy Tuesday. See you next week.
Bye.